statistics. Southern Sudan is said to be roughly the size of France. It's said to have 50 kilometers of paved road and an illiteracy rate of 80%. So both in economic, infrastructure and social development terms, there's a momentous task if this country succeeds. Where do they begin?
Absolutely. I mean, the challenges are almost insurmountable, you would imagine, from the outset. You've got a population, a relatively small population of around 8.5 million people, but a rapidly advancing population given the fact that a lot of the expatriate community are now returning. As you mentioned, an illiteracy rate of 80%, tremendous health problems, tremendous instability problems around the region. But at the same time, if you look at the gains achieved since the CPA was signed in 2005, those gains have been tremendous. And when I was in Juba in September last year, you get a very tangible sense of the possibility for a new future for the country as a whole. And of course, one needs to start with the basic building blocks. And fortunately, and I think whether this referendum is successful or not, you're going to see a tremendous amount of international assistance being plugged into infrastructure, education and health, which since 2005 has soaked up about 70 to 80% of donor financing for the region as a whole.
Obviously, as Africa's third largest oil producer, Sudan has seen very high growth rates in recent years, even hitting the 10% mark. How much of that is attributed to Southern Sudan? How much of Southern Sudan is a productive economy in general?
Well, one needs to consider that 98% of the government of South Sudan's oil revenues have been generated by oil since 2005, which is obviously a tremendous amount. North Sudan is reliant majorly on agriculture as well as oil. 45% of Sudan's economy as a whole is generated by agriculture, and that's much the same ratio north and south. So you're seeing a very imbalanced economy in terms of a tremendous reliance on agriculture and an overwhelming reliance on oil revenues. So when you look at Sudan's growth, look at 2006, the economy grew, as you said, at around 10%, tapered off substantially in 2009, due almost exclusively to the fact that the oil price went from $140 to more than half of that volume. So one of the major structural problems, which not only South Sudan but North Sudan really needs to tackle, is this overwhelming dependence on oil revenues. So when you're looking at the balance of growth, where it comes from, most of the oil revenues are generated within the southern region. Most of the oil blocks are in the south and in certain disputed border areas. But obviously, given the CPA, those have been shared 50-50 since 2005.
Oh, well, obviously the region is endowed with natural resources. There's oil, there's also iron ore, copper, gold, amongst a plethora of other minerals. Firstly, the big concern is don't subscribe to the resource curse depending on one thing like oil. But secondly, it's about how to manage these other resources to really try to fast-track growth. What could they do?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that inspires me the most about South Sudan, should it gain independence in the next couple of weeks and months, is the fact that the country which will emerge in this current era in the world system is very different to the system which was the status quo for most African countries engaging in independence in the 60s and 70s in the last century. Suddenly, a new country has far more options, and the development community internationally is far more mature. We understand what can go wrong. We understand the ramifications of poor policies, of developmental objectives which are misdirected. And as you say, we understand the potential pitfalls of this so-called resource curse, which wasn't necessarily the case in 1960, 1970. So I think the learnings, and you're seeing Ghana, for example, and Uganda, we have recently found oil, engaging with international companies to try and manage these revenues proactively and sustainably. And I think South Sudan will do the same, given the amount of international presence and attention that has been focused on the region. We
have seen companies mainly from East Africa clamoring to enter the Southern Sudanese market, irrespective of the political situation. Banks like KCB, we've seen some of the cement manufacturers getting in there, East African breweries. We were speaking to our analyst earlier on. The prospects for growth in terms of the market size that you're talking about, 8 million people that can tap into, a lot of things are imported, so there's a fear of runaway inflation in that economy.
The growth prospects are tremendous. You need to consider that coming from an almost non-existent base in 2005, companies that engaged or were willing to engage in that market and take on the risks were tapping into a market that there was no other competition. And we're seeing South African breweries brewing a local beer called White Bull Lager, which is tremendously successful given the symbolism of the White Bull and so on. And their brewery plant is located in South Sudan as a whole. So there are massive opportunities, and given the oil revenues which have accrued to the South since 2005, 2005, there's been a tremendous amount of capital and almost no industrial base, no base of activity which can tap into that from a local perspective. So the entrepreneurial community from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Uganda, even as far as Eastern DRC, has flocked to Juba particularly to take advantage of these opportunities. Of course, given that the economy does not have a significant structural base, these threats that you mentioned, such as runaway inflation, such as overvalued assets, and the price of certain things in Juba is far disproportionate to what it is in the regional market. Those risks are prevalent, but of course they provide opportunities.
Obviously, because you're almost going to be rebuilding a region or a prospective new country, infrastructure is going to be the hallmark of any investment activities, and we're likely to see major gains in the construction sector and the telecom sector, for instance, financing those projects. But where is the hidden growth in Southern Sudan?
The thing that jumps to mind immediately is agriculture. And if you look beyond agriculture, you're looking at things like biofuels. In the north of Sudan, they've recently opened a biofuels plant, Kinana Sugar Company, Brazilian machinery, and they're already exporting ethanol to the European Union. When I flew into Juba, for example, your ideas perhaps of Sudan are largely framed by impressions of the north. You fly in and it's emerald green. The Nile River is snaking through this area, which is vastly unpopulated, and the agricultural potential is truly, truly staggering. So if that is able to be managed productively and effectively, it could provide to be a breadbasket for the whole Eastern Central African region. And I think given the way that the world is shifting, commodities, particularly land, are becoming far more valuable assets. And if South Sudan can manage that, I think that's a hidden growth area which I think many of us don't quite appreciate.
You know, in just that one sentence, emerald green, you gave me a very vivid picture of what it looks like. Okay, oil revenue and sharing of oil revenues has been the central focus of a lot of discussions within Sudan and internationally. And we know that the reserves may be in the south, but a lot of the productive capacity, the pipelines are in the north. So we don't really know what's going to be decided post this situation, so we have to wait and see. But the opportunities that exist for investors in the oil and gas sector, where do they lie?
Well, you're right. Most of the current oil fields lie in the south, but you need to remember that a tremendous amount of instability in regions like Darfur, which is huge, have prevented any drilling or any prospecting of oil. And preliminary estimates claim that there could be significant amount of oil in that region alone. Some government members in South Sudan are saying that currently the whole of Sudan is pumping around 500,000 barrels of oil a day. Some ambitious government members in the south believe that they could rival Angola if they were able to release tenders for exploration and drilling throughout the country. So there's tremendous unexploited assets in that region. And I think currently you've got the Malaysian interests, the Chinese and Indian interests to an extent are dominating the market. But once the sanctions are lifted and United States corporations are able to engage with South Sudan, you're going to see a tremendous rush for those assets.
And finally, I mean, all things being equal, there is donor fatigue, there is a sluggish global recovery, and there is competition within the emerging market space for the investment that Southern Sudan needs. What would their investment case be for an investor who's saying, why not take my money to South Korea or Mexico? Why should they go to Southern Sudan?
You're correct that there is donor fatigue, but I think there's certain areas in the world where donors are still willing and engaged and proactively able to allocate and mobilize resources. And if you look at the global picture, a lot of that funding is going to chase areas or examples where you can achieve very rapid and very nascent growth. And I think South Sudan is one of those. I don't anticipate a decline in donor interest or assistance for South Sudan. In fact, if they are able to gain independence in this referendum, I think you'll see a significant uptick in that donor assistance. The trick is South Sudanese organizations, the government of South Sudan, the Bank of South Sudan, civil society needs to be empowered by those initiatives. Otherwise, what we'll see in 10, 15 years' time is an economy which is thriving but run entirely by either donor institutions or by foreign entities. So that's the real trick, training and empowerment. And I think, to be honest, from my brief interaction with the ministers there and with the donor community there, the will seems to be very powerful to engage proactively with that.
Simon Freemantle, an economist at Standard Bank, thank you so much for a wonderful perspective and just a colourful picture and depiction of what's going on in Southern Sudan.